by the island wars, island hopping. The US Navy's strategy to take out key strategic islands in the Japanese Empire, slowly strangling the Japanese until they have no supplies left. We're going to go to island hopping today and the US strategy of island hopping. By early 1943, the Japanese Empire had reached its height. They had occupied and gotten countries such as Malaya, Burma, the Philippines, and the Dutch Indies, which is now called Indonesia today. These territories were vital to the Japanese Empire for supplies such as raw material, food, water, oil, and everything else that they would need. Now the US had plans to roll back the Japanese Empire. The aim was to vitally cut the Japanese Empire supply lines and the Imperial Navy, and seizing occupied territories. Japan would then be strangled from a lack of supplies. Via the Pacific Ocean. The US would need to come up with new methods of mobile war in the vast Pacific Sea. Most tactics were amphibious landings with air support, but first the US Navy would bombard the island and then Russian amphibious landings and then air support. The Japanese were unable to match the firepower of the US. They had to resort to desperate measures. The country used ancient and traditional military tactics of bonsai charges and kamikazes, which was a form of fight to the death and then surrender and die. It was to fight to the death instead of surrendering. But the Japanese had mass casualties. It was the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire. At the start of the Pacific War, the US had two choices to defeat Japan. Sir Douglas MacArthur suggested A. The primary land base to capture the Solomon Isles, Papua and New Guinea, and the Philippines. They could then turn into a strategic base that would cut off the Japanese resources, and also their new colonies of Burma and the Dutch Indies and Malaya. The US Navy had a different plan. They would capture a string of smaller islands and bypass the heavily fortified Burma, Solomon Isles and the Philippines. And these tiny islands were closer to the Japanese homeland, making it good for strategic bombing on the Japanese homeland. But at the end of the day, the military didn't make a choice and both started their campaigns. MacArthur launched his plan in 1943. In June 1943, it was called Operation Cartwheel. The first target was the Japanese base at Rabid in the Solomon Islands. It was a two-pronged attack. The eastern prong fought through New Georgia and Bolivar, and the western prong fought through Papua and New Guinea, but the jungle and hot climate made progression on. It took 9 months before the two prongs met at an isolated Rabid. Meanwhile, the US Navy had a mighty fleet, 4 aircraft carriers. They had Hellcats and a Course fighter class fighter, dive bombers and torpedo bombers. They had outclassed and outperformed the Japanese air carriers and planes. The Navy's first target were two islands called Manki and Tarawa. These were close to supply lines across the Pacific. A week went by as the atolls were bombarded by air. November 20th, 1943, an amphibious landing was launched on Manki. It was captured with little resistance, but Tarawa was a different story. Recon had failed to tell the land forces the water was too shallow for landing, so the Marines had to swim from a distance, as the island had many machine gun nests. By the end of the day, over 1,500 of the 5,000 Marines were either dead or injured. For the next 2 days, the Japanese were pushed back inch by inch. Flamethrowers were used to great effect, flushing out the Japanese nest and strong points. It took 3 days for the last pocket of Japanese resistance to be dealt with. Out of 4,200 Japanese soldiers, only 14 were captured. Tarawa was the first of many operations to be like that, in the sense of it won't be easy. It would be much harder than the US had anticipated to capture a small island in the Pacific. The Japanese didn't surrender. It was because the Japanese didn't surrender and they would fight to the last man. 1944, the naval offensive moved onto the Marshall Islands. Admiral Ochestra Nimitz ordered aircraft from his carriers to strike the island for 2 months. By February 1st, 1944, the amphibious landing force was ready to land. The flat island of Roa was quickly overrun. Numura, on the other hand, the Japanese refused to quit and resisted. The US forces used flamethrowers to great effect and explosive weapons as well to get the Japanese out of their nests. The Japanese responded with the traditional tactic of Bandai charge, a suicidal attack. But the US quickly caught on, and the Japanese strategy was quickly outdone, and the Japanese were pushed back. Over 8,000 Japanese soldiers died compared to 400 US Marines. Atoll after atoll, the US had captured. Kawalaji, Iwakatok, and Turok were cut off from the rest, though a small garrison of Japanese soldiers were undefeated until the end of the war. The next push was the Marianas Islands. If occupied, the US heavy bombers would be in range of mainland Japan, and also block every and most supply routes from Southeast Asia. In 1944, the US attacked the Marianas for 4 days as the US stormed Saipan. Still, at the end of the day, the terrain was mountainous. The terrain had mountains and was full of caves, and bombardment did little to slow or do anything or disturb the Japanese positions at all. But at the end of the day, the US had a foothold on the beach. In Tokyo, the Japanese were alarmed as they sent their naval fleet to to rescue Saipan because they knew it would be in strategic location to mainland Japan. They sent a carrier fleet to rescue Saipan and save the Marianas, but the task force was spotted by U.s submarines. On July 19, 1944, the Japanese launched airstrikes against the U.S ships, but radar saw them coming. 450 fighters were scrambled and were planned to intercept the Japanese planes. It became the largest aircraft battle ever fought. The U.S. task force had more than 15 carriers, 900 planes. But on the Japanese side, they only had 9 carriers and 500 planes. But the Japanese lost more of its experienced crew in the Solomon Isles and Marshall Islands campaigns. Their inexperienced pilots were faced with battle-ready US pilots. The Japanese were outgunned and outmatched. They would be known as the Great Marinara Turkey Shoot. Half an hour into the battle, a US torpedo hit the largest and newest carrier, the Toho, while she was still getting aircraft off of her runway. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was a US victory. Around the same time, another US submarine torpedoed Shaku. She was sunk, but the Japanese continued to fight in hopes that they could stop the US from advancing into Saipan and landing on the other Mariana Islands. But the rest of the day, the US tried to pin down the remaining Japanese fleet. It took until noon to find them, but in the late evening, General Mark Mitchum decided to take a gamble and attack the Japanese at night. The third Japanese carrier, Hiyo, was sunk by the Japanese and lost more than 300 aircraft, and the US fighters tried to turn back, but it was getting dark and late, as most of them had to bail out in the sea or crash on the runway. General Mission had to take another gamble: turn on the lights or be spotted, or leave off the lights and let the men perish. He decided to go with the lights. Surprisingly, they weren't spotted by Japanese submarines, even though the US lost over 80 aircraft. But the Japanese losses were even greater. The defeat of the Japanese fleet meant that the US could now advance further into the Mariana Islands. By June 1944, it advanced further. The Japanese held out for 3 weeks before they were overrun on July 9, 1944. But the final horror was when Japanese civilians of the Mariana Islands jumped to their death off a cliff because they were taught that they shouldn't surrender to the Americans. The last band of Japanese soldiers launched their banzai attack. 32,000 Japanese were killed, but the Americans also lost 3,000 men. 2 weeks later, the US Navy launched on Guam and Tinian. Also in the Marianas, once again the Japanese employed kamikaze attacks, which were basically banzai charges. I said kamikaze because it's basically the same thing, only kamikazes are more famous with planes. So if you're confused by that, sorry. 2 weeks later, the US Navy landed. But it was no news. The Americans advanced and seized the Marianas. Both U.S. Army and U.S. Navy had now completed the sep- their separate campaigns. Their first phase to isolate Japan from its supplies and resources. But now the military planners had to take a choice for phase two. Either go with General MacArthur's plan of the Philippines and Burma and New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, or continue the island hopping strategy of of the Navy. But General MacArthur persuaded President Roosevelt to go with his plan first. So the Navy had to help General MacArthur before they can return to their island hopping campaign. MacArthur wanted to seize Taiwan and the Ryukyu Islands. The new naval plan was swifter and more effective at isolating Japan without a huge amount of casualties. I left out the Philippines because that's going to be in the series, so hush hush on that. But the decision, fine, you again a little bit. But the decision to invade and liberate the Philippines were costly, costing over many Japanese, US, and civilian lives in the process of trying to capture the Philippines. But the Japanese had one more card up their sleeve. Very risky, but the Japanese would lose its last remaining fleet. The operation was called Operation So, which in Japanese meant victory. The plan was basically that the Japanese would lose its last remaining resources and naval power to trick the Americans and regain hold of the Philippines. So this is basically the plan in simple terms of military strategy. The main fleet was separated into two prongs, which formed basically a semicircle around the enemy. So on the first prong, the Japanese would move through through the San Bernardino Strait, while the other half would go through Shirigaru Strait and attack from the south, but wait. Meanwhile, a decoy group would lead the American landing crafts and bases away from the beaches and guide the US landing forces out so the Japanese could try and retake the island. But in the end, it was a success in the first half, but inevitably they failed and lost all of their naval power. Now they were completely defenseless in the enemy. The Japanese were still desperate, as they knew kamikaze attacks, the ones in the planes now, the plane ones, okay? They look forward to special units, also known as kamikaze units, suicide squads. It drew inspiration from the military code, like I said, of to die than surrender and live as a coward. The US were closing on the Japanese as it was starved from oil, food, water, and resources. But now the US was at a crossroads of invading Japan because they wanted the war to end, but they didn't want to invade mainland Japan. but in the spring of 1945, the US were closing in on the Japanese in the southeast, but in the south and east, but the West was a separate campaign that had started in Burma when the Japanese took Burma because they invaded China in 1973, but the Chinese were allied with the West. And that is basically it for the video. Wait, I hope you liked it. It was pretty good. I found it to be quite interesting. Sorry I died so much in Red Ochestra Rising Storm. Pretty good game. I kinda cheated, played with bots a little bit, but I have them on expert mode. So yeah, these bots will kick ass though. So yes, I will try to do more games where I'm actually playing with people. But the problem with that is that I don't want to say the game is dead, but I'm not really seeing a lot of people playing it. Because, I mean, it's kind of an old game, don't get me wrong. We still have a strong community. But Red Orchestra 2 is coming out, which is set in Vietnam, so. But COD, I don't know. People are liking the World War II thing now, so they might come back to it. So, you never know. So, I hope you enjoyed. I'm going to edit this video now. I'm going to die. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed. Just a sample of what's to come. Yes, they got home already. So, I'm going to see you in the next chapter. I hope you learned something.